Okay, this is going to be a new one because I have notes and I have a prop, which is the actual book we're reviewing, so. Hey friends, it's your good friend Tim Campbell-Smith, and today we are reviewing the first book on this channel, which is a mental health book that I love. That comes with a caveat, we'll talk about it. But there's a book on mental health that I absolutely love called It Didn't Start With You by Mark Wolynn, and we're gonna talk about this book, what it talks about, and I think some tips and tricks on how to read it, and what it can reveal to us about our mental health. This is a book about epigenetics, fancy biochemical term, which we'll talk about, and how epigenetics affects your mental health. Overall, I recommend this book, but with a caveat. Don't read the whole thing. I'll tell you why, and I'll tell you what to read. Before we go too far, make sure you like and subscribe for all things mental health, photography, business, career, life. Okay, so the book is called It Didn't Start With You, How Inherited Family Trauma Shapes Who We Are and How to End the Cycle. It's written by Mark Wolynn, who has degrees and graduate degrees in both English and psychology. So the book, It Didn't Start With You, is based on the concept of epigenetics, which, let's start with what that is. Epigenetics is this phenomenon where physical changes happen, usually to your DNA, that can't always be seen biochemically, but they absolutely affect your body and they can get passed on to other people. That's epigenetics. The book starts out with, and keeps going, and keeps going, and keeps going, about how part of our own psychology and our own mental health is affected by both of our birth parents and our grandparents, all of our grandparents. That's epigenetics, and how it applies to psychology. If you've ever heard the term intergenerational trauma, this is the biochemical study of that and how trauma gets passed down through family trees. More on that later. Now, in exploring what is epigenetics and how does it work, this actually brings me to my main critique of the book. The author, Mark Wolynn here, spends, I would say, about somewhere between half and 2/3 of the book just trying to convince you that epigenetics is real. Now, this might have been a problem for me because I didn't need to be convinced. I already knew it was a thing. I have a friend who's studying epigenetics in university, and I had heard about it, I had learned about it before, so I didn't need to be convinced that this was a real thing. And the research is super solid. But the book spends half to 2/3 just telling you, like, what is epigenetics? How do we know that it's real? And essentially explaining what it is. So, rather than reading half to 2/3 of the book, let me quickly explain what is epigenetics and how is it affecting your mental health. Let's keep this in practical terms. Basically, when your father has produced the sperm in his body, he has encoded the psychological experiences of both of his parents and himself into that sperm. We know that our experiences and our psychology kind of goes throughout our body, and that involves going into the sperm as well. So it encodes all of his psychological experiences up until the moment when his sperm is made, is going into that sperm. And then all of the psychological experiences of his parents up until when his father produced the sperm and his mother produced an egg and was inseminated and he was birthed, that all of that psychological experience got encoded into his sperm. That made who you are and made who I am today. And then same principle with your mother, but with one exception. So both of your mother's parents' psychological experience got encoded into their sperm and their eggs, passed down to your mother. The only difference is with women, there's a little bit longer time when she's encoding her psychological experiences onto you biologically, because she has an extra 9 months of when you're in the womb. And there was interesting research, both in the book and that I've read, where mothers are still imprinting their psychological experiences onto their unborn babies while they are in the womb, before they come into the world. That's the concept of epigenetics. So, and the book also explains how it includes both your parents and your grandparents, and you're included in that. So it's technically 3 generations. You, your parents, and all of your grandparents. So there are 6 people whose epigenetics, whose psychological experience is affecting you, is affecting me, is affecting all of us, whether we're aware of it or not. So at this point in the book, I started to wonder, okay, Well, and if there's anything I've learned about psychology, I'm fascinated by the evolutionary perspective. Why does this happen? Why are we passing down psychological experiences to others? And the book made a really interesting case for the double-edged sword, the both pro and con. Evolutionary Psychology 101, basically, we're always trying to understand how did an adaptation or how did something happening help humans survive? And that explains why we pass it on to others to try and help them survive. So what is the benefit of passing on psychological experiences, and especially trauma? Well, Mark, the author, makes a case. Would you rather go into battle? And it's kind of like you're going into battle with your parents and your grandparents on your side. Would you rather go into battle with someone who has had to do battle before, who's experienced trauma? Because they're not only passing down their trauma, they're passing down their coping mechanisms and what they did to survive. Would you rather go to battle with someone who has already been to battle and who knows how to, say, use a sword? Or would you rather go to battle with someone who's never used a sword and never been to battle? So there is kind of a benefit because you have the survival instincts of your parents and of your grandparents. And any resiliency, and everybody has resiliency to some degree or another, you also get the resilience and the tenacity and those survival instincts as well. So the book has a really interesting background into what is epigenetics, how is the psychological experience of your parents and your grandparents affecting you. And then it goes on to say, okay, here's how you deal with it. And especially that really hard stuff that we don't always want or we don't always want to deal with, right? Because you inherit, the fears of your parents, but sometimes that may not be realistic in your life. You may not need that in your life. For example, my parents and my grandparents were farmers. They lived their life, and especially their food intake, according to cycles, ebbs and flows. So, which explains why I know in my life I've had some strange beliefs and experiences around food. And I realized part of that is coming from my parents and my grandparents and what they experienced with food and food insecurity because they were farmers. And then I said, well, I don't need to believe those things. I don't need to hold on to those things. Now, that's easy to say. You actually have to deal with it. And then that's where the book goes, is what do we do with these experiences that we have inherited consciously and unconsciously from our parents and our grandparents? And this brings me to my recommendation on how to read the book. I say read part 1. The book is actually divided into 3 parts. If you look at the table of contents, it actually gets broken down into 3 parts. Part 1 is the web of family trauma. Part 2 is the core language map. And part 3 is pathways to reconnection. Here's what I say. Read parts 1, read part 3, skip part 2. The author, Mark Wolynn, would probably kill me for saying that, but let me explain. Part 1 really explains what is epigenetics. It convinces you that it's real, and in the case studies and the research, gives examples of how it shows up in your life. I didn't need to be convinced that it was real, but I did appreciate the case studies and the examples to go, oh, here's how the psychological experiences of your parents and your grandparents will show up in your own life. But I didn't need convincing otherwise. Then go on to read part 3. And this is the part where you start to act on your knowledge or your awareness of inherited trauma or harm. And the recommendations that are made aren't terribly groundbreaking, at least not for me, because I've, done a lot of the work around mental health. So they're all skills that I've seen before. The 3 skills that he used that Mark Wolynn recommends involves mindfulness, self-talk, and journaling. So, mindfulness is, I would argue, if there's anything I've learned in all of my years and experience with therapy and healing and working through my mental health, it's that mindfulness, the practice of slowing down and just being aware of your surroundings and your experiences and your responses, that's the secret to mental health in general. Next is self-talk, and the book actually encourages you to talk, to verbalize these conversations, even if with yourself, even if in your head. Have the conversation with yourself, with your parents, with your grandparents. Even if, and 99.9% of the time, it's probably going to be imaginary, but have the conversation. What would you say to those folks? What would you want them to say to you? What would you hope they say to you? And then part of that, you might mix the two. I found it easier to tie the self-talk into point number 3, which is journaling. Actually, and the book has some great journal prompts about what to write, what to say, what you might reflect on. The reason why I say skip part 2 is because it was kind of fluff. It felt like fluff to me. It was much more about the author's language and how he wanted to talk about epigenetics and passed down trauma and harm. It didn't really add anything. And when you go to part 3, which is where you actually start practicing mindfulness and the self-talk and the journaling, he uses the language there in part 3, but the language isn't overly complex. It's not hard to understand the terms that he's using. So we didn't need a whole section of the book to explain those terms and those concepts, where he also further tries to convince you that epigenetics is real. Overall, I really do recommend this book. It Didn't Start With You by Mark Wolynn, How Inherited Family Trauma Shapes Who We Are and How to End the Cycle. I just recommend that you don't read the whole book. You don't need to read the whole thing. And if you are reading it and taking it in and doing the work, it's going to be dense enough on its own, so you don't need to do the whole thing. Anything that you can do to be, I hate to say this, be more efficient with your mental health, you can skip part 2. Read part 1, read part 3, work your way through part 3. Overall, I also really loved that the book is a reminder that there are many parts of your mental health that are your own, and there are some parts of your mental health and your psychological experience that are not your own. And I've always thought, own what you can. I said that in equity work, in justice work, a good apology, own what you can, don't own anything else. But some things we don't have to own, right? There comes a time when you can say, this has been your experience. It does not need to be my experience. Comment and let me know if you've read the book and what you thought, or if there's anything piquing your interest about this book. Otherwise, make sure to like and subscribe for all things mental health, for conversations like this, career, business, photography, life. Otherwise, we'll chat soon. Bye for now.